when I belong. That's
Hey there, Ronnie. How you doing? Where's your name? Still the same. Is this Lynn?
I was disappointed that she mentioned my grandfather because he was always his name is Long. Well, they probably got some of it. Makes a lot of
And I was still I wanted your autograph for the last where we could not take
that wonderful picture of the back door. We all do a big I love it. I keep it out all the time.
Tina's husband.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. That's what I'm known by.
I think they were supposed to maybe deliver some this afternoon, supposed to deliver something tomorrow. Those two boys, they couldn't run. Man, his daughter. Even next week. So we sit on for the 16th. You're ready
I told Valerie, not Eddie, let's play on it.
It's beautiful. And her story is on the wall.
It's beautiful. I've been doing a lot of research into history of White County. All about the coal mines and
This is Amy Greer. Nice to meet you, Evelyn. This is her
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Oh, ding, 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 ding. All right. Thank you. Thank you. I'm Amy Greer. I serve as the Vice President for Institutional Advancement at Mountain Empire Community College and the Executive Director for the MECC Foundation. This is part of a series of events that we have planned for the Wampler Library this year in coordination with our wonderful art coordinator, Teresa Robinette. And we thank her for all of her work coordinating this particular exhibit, as well as bringing our author here today. So I'm so happy to see a crowd here. I'm excited about today's exhibit, and I'm happy that you all are here to learn more about recreation and baseball specifically in Southwest Virginia. As part of the exhibit, we also have a partnership with the Southwest Virginia Museum and Historical State Park. And I'm going to let someone that I kind of know come up and talk. So welcome, Mr. Bart Greer.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I was thinking, I don't really have anything written down, and it's bouncing around my head the things I wanted to say because I had such a good experience working with Talmadge over the summer. But I really look forward every year when we work with a lot of youth organizations like the YCC, the Youth Conservation Corps, or in Talmadge's example, AmeriCorps, because they usually send the cream of the crop to us, and Talmadge was an example of that. I'll be first to tell you, as far as this exhibit goes, I was pretty much hands-off on a lot of this. I kept him in between some bumper rails and gave him some suggestions or pointers, but this is really his product from thought to end result. It really is, as far as that goes. We batted around some themes and some different things, but the thing that I really am happy about when it comes to coordinating and partnering with organizations like the college and the Wampler Library here is that we get to bring things out of the collection at the museum that don't get to see the light of day very often, things that are worthy of being scene, things that have those stories associated with them. So that's one of the most exciting things I think about exhibits like this, and I want to continue to work with Mount Empire and with the Wampler Library as we move forward. But without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Talmadge Gunter. Talmadge was a 2024 graduate of Lee High School, right? And then you also were a dual enrollment student, so you have your associate's degree from Mountain Empire, and currently you're a student at UVA Charlottesville. Yes, all right, so Talmadge Gunter.
So, yeah, Burke gave me wow, I wish everybody would introduce me like that, no matter where I went. But Burke is very humble, too humble. He says he was hands-off, and he was essential. I had no clue what I was doing when I came in. That was part of why I wanted to work with the museum this summer. I wanted to learn, and it really was a learning experience. So don't let Burke fool you. He was way more involved than he let on. But as he mentioned, I am in Charlottesville right now, and it's been a very good experience, and I've got exposed to a lot of new concepts. And one thing that I've learned that I've kind of reflected on back to this project and to the exhibit are two Greek ideas. It's logos and pathos. And so they sound really fancy, but they're really simple. Logos is our thought. It's our thought, our reasoning, our logic. And then our pathos is our emotion, our passions, our desires. And when you look back at history, a lot of history is logos. It's a lot of reasoning. It's very intellectual. But what I like with what we did with the recreation is we focused on the pathos. We focused on what people did for enjoyment, for things that made them happy. That's what we did with music, with toys, with recreation in general. It was things that people did out of enjoyment, which is not always focused on it. And so I'm really happy with how it turned out. I'm happy with my experience, and I'm also happy that it aligned with Teresa's exhibit and the baseball collection. So I'm just really happy to be here, and I'm just happy to be back home and excited to see the rest of the reception. I don't know what's next, so I can't give anybody an impressive introduction like Burke did.
So the exhibits that Talmadge put together are located in the glass cases, and there's a glass case out front. Maybe, Burke, will you say maybe a couple of notable things that might be of interest to folks?
Sure. The three cases, really, the thing that he worked with was the theme of play. It's something that's universal. We all play, whether you think about it or not, we play, right? We play sports, we play music. We do all of these things kind of innately. So we use those things those concepts to draw on our collection at the museum. One thing that's really cool is this 1900 championship, Southwest Virginia Champions Baseball, has a lot of the names on it from Big Stone that you would recognize, like Fox. John Fox is on there. Wentz's name is on there. Slimp's name is on there as well. So that's a really neat thing. And then one other thing is the Dunbar Band hat across the way. Every one of the coal camps had their own band, which was essential to that community development. And we were lucky to have things that are left behind from that. So the Dunbar Band hat is really cool. In the bottom of this case over here is also some sheet music that was owned by John Fox Jr. He signed it, so you'll see his autograph on that as well. And then out in the front case, the big case, it's just fun. It's just toys. It's just toys. Different toys from different eras. And some things you could have ordered out of the mail order catalog. We gave some examples of where you could have gotten things through Sears and other mail orders back then. But we just like to have fun with it. So the concept of play in general is really what Talmadge worked on and worked with. And then we just collected artifacts out of the museum's collection and went with it, didn't we?
Okay. Well, I'm very happy to introduce Teresa Robinette. Teresa has been coordinating several exhibits here at the Wampler Library Slimp Gallery. She's done amazing work and has put so many hours into making this library a beautiful place that is active and just fulfilling for our students. So I'll bring Teresa up, and she'll introduce our guest speaker as well as our quilt artist.
Thank you all for being here. I just love looking out and seeing familiar faces and new faces, and I really appreciate you so much. First, I just real quick want to say I wouldn't be here without Amy and without all of her organizing of this. And without Meg and her library staff, I think I would lose my mind trying to pull all this together. So thank you all, and I really, really appreciate it. Doing this exhibit, the one thing I can say that it's kind of about is a community, which we have a very particular community here with a very particular history, and about friends. We have a quilt that changes regularly back there, and I put out a call to someone I had known, who's Evelyn Hoskins, our quilter here, for many, many years. I even knew her mom when I was little, so longtime family friend from the Ramsey and Bear Creek section of Norton, who is also Greer, Bert Greer and his family were kind of like neighbors. So it gets very close in community, which is what I love about being back in Appalachia. And when Eveline picked her quilt, I had no idea she'd pick a quilt that had a history with my own mother, who she and my mom had found this pattern, and Eveline completed it in 2022 after my mom had passed away a few years ago. But it has the imprints of that kind of friendship of quilting and sharing stories. So I hope you get a chance to go back and look and read the story about her and my mom and how they kind of came about. But Lynn is a completely different story. She is somebody that I've known for a long time, a great friend of mine, who came to this area with her parents. One of them had been from West Virginia and another one from Pennsylvania, so she's thinking maybe it's similar, but it's different. We are different. And she really wasn't a big person who knew a lot about baseball or sports. It's not her personality, and if you get to know her, you'll realize that. But she opened a book of Lee County history, and she saw some pictures of miners in baseball shirts that said the Miners, and she said, "Did miners play baseball?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "My dad, my uncle, and several people I knew were playing on these teams, and these guys would come down from New York and Cincinnati, and they would scout them." And she was just stunned by the idea you could go underground in the dark and you could come out in the bright daylight and you could play a game and you could play. And that led to her art. She was an artist in New Mexico as well as a tour guide, so she's a great speaker. But her art is indicative of what she found when she went on this research to understand baseball in our community. So without further ado, L.M. Sutter, Lynn Sutter.
Well, disclaimer, any similarity between what I'm wearing today and the New York Mets is purely coincidental. Well, I am also, like Teresa, glad to see some very familiar and much loved faces and some new ones. And so welcome. This is really kind of, I see some familiar faces there. Come in here. No, you're fine. So this is really a new experience for me to be talking about art. I'm accustomed to talking about baseball. There's nothing I love better than to get up and blather in front of a crowd about baseball. And that's because I'm backed by some of the world's most famous sets and players, or characters from baseball. But this is the first time that I've ever really talked about my art. And art is scary. Art is scary because art allows the viewer to sort of peer into the soul of the artist and try to discover what has moved them and what they are inspired by. And obviously, what moves me, if you looked at any of the pieces on your way in, is what is lost or what is about to be lost. I feel like there's a peculiar beauty in something that still exists but is about to exist no longer. And my sense is that buildings, especially houses, are carapaces for us or turtle shells for us. And I sort of think that the longer a building, such as a house, is inhabited by human beings, the more the walls sort of thrum and vibrate with the emotions that those people left behind. So my pieces are as much about the people who aren't there any longer as the tangibles that they left behind them. So, like a lot of people, I bet every one of you, I love looking into or at abandoned buildings, particularly houses, because I want to know more about the people who lived there, what they wanted out of life, what they got out of life, what they cooked for dinner, where they put the Christmas tree. And so there's no place in the world like a coal camp for just a sheer volume of empty structures that are sinking into themselves, and all are in varying degrees of ruin. I mean, if you go to Jenkins, you'll see that there are a lot of people still living in those camp houses, but when you go to other places, there's nothing left. There are no people living there. Now, mining camps used to stretch all the way from the eastern United States far out into the west. The layout of a camp, whether they're mining gold, coal, iron, lead, molybdenum, the layout is all basically the same. You've got a grid or a line in the center where the miners' houses are, and smack in the middle of that you had the superintendent's house so that he could sort of keep a big brotherly eye on what was going on. You've got the stores, you've got the particularly the company store, you've got clinics, you've got churches, you've got schools. So what is left of these once thriving communities now, sadly, is just skeletons. And the stories are apparently lost for most of them. So with these pieces, I'm making up stories, I'm creating stories, and I'm adding some intimate detail, like a broken radio or a book on the floor or a forgotten majorette boot. Because it is in the detritus of a human life, these lives that are long ended, it's those little objects that sort of sing the loudest, saddest songs, I think. So I try to work those into the pieces. Now, some of the pieces represent coal camps that I've been to, places in Appalachia and in the West. Some even represent buildings that I've seen in the vastness of the Mississippi River bottoms of West Tennessee, where I used to live. Others are just purely from my imagination, but they all speak of uprootedness and loss. So baseball research took me to a lot of coal camps. And a lot of the rooms, as I said, were inspired by these deteriorating buildings that I saw there. But since I was there researching baseball, the things that really struck me were the fields, the ballparks, if they still existed, and most of them did not. Now, I don't know if anybody ever knew the late, great West Virginia historian Stuart McGee, but he once said, the best way to figure out a mountain community is what they do with the few bits of flat land that they have. And with a coal camp, the flat land was dedicated to the baseball parks. And some of the baseball parks in Appalachia and in the West are absolutely legendary, and some in not so good ways. For instance, in Dant, legend has it that the baseball field is built on one mass grave of a lot of, you've heard this, of anonymous miners from Europe who came over and were killed in the explosions to build the Clinchfield Railroad. Do you think that's true?
Yes, ma'am, it definitely is. Yes, it was the Sandy Ridge Tunnel through the mountain there.
Okay, we've got it.
On the railroad.
Yeah.
Yeah, they hauled them out and buried them right there.
Whoa.
That's definitely a fact.
That's hallowed ground.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well,
Not right off. Maybe 8 or 10.
ooh. Well, now a lot of people will remember Dorchester, and the diamond at Dorchester was also legendary because it was bounded on one side by a railroad track, on the other a corn patch, and the other a creek. Now, if you don't think that the outfielders on the Dorchester team took advantage of that, because there's really nothing easier when you're trying to get a ball that's been hit into the corn, nothing easier than getting it back into the infield if you happen to have a spare, which they did frequently. Now, one of my favorite places, because I used to live quite near it, was and I'm going to say this word again, and you can look it up if you want to, it's a real thing, molybdenum. The Torero camp of New Mexico, up near Pecos, New Mexico, mined molybdenum. And their baseball park sat at 10,000 feet. Now, talk about your home field advantage. So, it's pretty easy to win a game when the visiting team is busy passing out for the entire game. And they did. Now, one of the few remaining coal camps that still has a baseball diamond is in Madrid, New Mexico, which had the peculiar distinction of mining both anthracite and bituminous coal in the same camp. And in its heyday, it was over 3,000 people. There's a really adorable picture of a little boy. If you've seen that, that's taken at Madrid. He later grew up to be a New Mexico Supreme Court justice. But Madrid was well known for their love of spectacular Christmas decorations. And so in the heyday, at Christmas time, flights headed from California to Texas or vice versa would be sort of shunted over a little bit so that the passengers could see all the Christmas lights down below them. So now there are fewer than 300 people left in Madrid. It's a very artsy little community, and I will give them props because they are working hard trying to save their baseball park. So now, when coal towns were vibrant and alive, they were the very epitome of the 20th century industrial camp. And those camps were not just coal camps, they were railroad camps, they were furniture making camps, they were textile makers camps, but across the country, wherever these camps were, the common denominator was baseball. And why not? Because baseball has been a part of this country, well, almost since the very beginning. But let's talk about the actual, possibly prehistoric beginnings of baseball. So I don't know where I saw it, and I think it's in Africa. It's rock art on a cliffside, and it shows a person with a stick, and it shows another person with a round rock. And obviously, at some point in time, two people got together and realized how much fun it would be to hit a rock with a stick. And it's a very entertaining thing. Ask any golfer. Well, also, one of the few colored, besides this one of the few colored images up here is one of a 13th century Spanish manuscript. And it's a pretty accurate depiction of a baseball game. So when you see it, that is, well, about 1,000 years old. So they were playing baseball in Spain at some point, probably during the Inquisition, or not during the Inquisition times. Now, in England, in 1744, and there's also a woodcut of this, there was a book, probably one of the first children's books ever published, called A Little Pretty Pocketbook. And one of the rhymes was called base-ball. And so this is the rhyme. The ball once struck off, away flies the boy, to the next destined spot, and then home with joy, which is a pretty accurate description. And Jane Austen even talked about baseball. In Northanger Abbey, which was published in 1803, her protagonist, Catherine, talks about how much more she likes playing cricket and baseball than doing the girly things that she was expected to do. So, that's pretty early in England. But coming across the pond, Major League Baseball historian John Thorne discovered in the Pittsfield, Massachusetts bylaws of 1791, one of the laws was that there could be no baseball played within 80 yards of the meeting house, which tells me that they had lost quite a few windows already. Okay, so here we go. Traveling from the 18th century to the 19th century to the 1840s. Now, in the 1840s, in New York and in the cities, in the urban areas of the East, there were these social clubs of fairly well-to-do young men. And they usually had their own clubhouses. And they got together and they talked about cricket, and they smoked and they drank, and they talked about firefighting, and they smoked and they drank, and they also formed firefighting units, volunteer firefighting units. So when a fire would break out a couple of blocks over, these young men would be running through the narrow streets of New York, pulling a pumper to put out the fire. And so there was one particular group called the New York Knickerbocker Fire Engine Company Number 12. Does that ring a bell, or does one name out of it ring a bell? So in the 1840s, you had the New York Knickerbockers, the first official baseball team. They set about laying down some rules, and very soon it started catching on. And it did catch on like fire, like a wildfire. It caught on and it moved across the country. So a lot of people think, well, the Civil War actually spread baseball, but that's not true, because baseball was already all over the country by the time the conflict started. But what the Civil War did do was to democratize the sport, because up till that point you had teams like the Knickerbockers, the New York Fire Engine Company number 12, all well-heeled, all well-to-do, and they played a very staid, polite, sober game of baseball that probably wasn't very entertaining. But when the Civil War starts and they're coming into the conflict as officers, there are also enlisted men there. These boys, these raw rubes from the country or from the inner city, and they played a much fiercer, faster, much more fun game. Well, when the well-heeled young men realized that these guys could really throw, could really slide, could really, really play a game of baseball, they started thinking when the war was over and they got back to New York, I sure would like to have that guy from East Podunk because he had a powerful left arm. And you have, voila, the idea of the ringer introduced. And with the ringer, that's the person brought in to pitch, sometimes to catch, but mostly to pitch. With the idea of the ringer, you've got money entering baseball in a big way. So in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, this country was just convulsed with the passion for baseball. And all of the men who played the games in the diamonds, the major leaguers, were like rock stars, and they were treated like rock stars. And they were able to parlay their celebrity in athletics into other areas. For example, Arlie Latham, the subject of my 3rd book, the biography of him, he was such a wild character on the baseball diamond that he was able to walk off at the end of season and right onto the stage, which he did for many years. He did stage in New York, he did touring theater. He was very, very popular. Now, it's about this time that Mark Twain describes baseball in a way I'm sure you've all heard. The very symbol, the outward and visible expression of the drive and push and rush and struggle of the raging, tearing, booming 19th century. So for well over a century, baseball was the be-all and end-all, in fact, of American life. In the big cities, they had their major league teams, and they had their high-level minor league franchises. And then in smaller towns, there were the lower-level minor league franchises, and then down to semi-pro industrial ball, like we had in the coal fields. And I believe that for people in the coal camps, there was a very particular significance to baseball. I think it meant more to them. That may be a wild thing to say, but I believe it meant more to them than the people in the other parts of the world that had their own teams. Let's talk about coal camps. So in the 19th century, suddenly springing up in the Appalachians are these little camps. And they're not just coal, they're timber, they're railroad, and they're rough man camps, only men there. And it's reasonable to think that once they got at least 18 men in the camp and they could figure out a batting order, they started playing baseball, because it was by then the national pastime. But the men in the camps were kind of a rogue bunch. They were as quick to leave a job there and jump to the next one as they were to come in and sign up for the job in the beginning. So the coal brass understood after a while that to keep good workers in the camp, what they needed to do was make it an appealing place for families, so that men with wives and children would think twice before they would jump to the next coal mining job. So here we have the introduction of the civilizing influences of women and children and schools and churches and doctors and so on and so forth. And at this point also, you have people coming from Europe. They are coming to the camps to work as well. So you've got Greeks, and you've got Italians, and you've got Spanish, and you've got Czechs, and you've got Hungarians, and they're all coming to build this multi-ethnic, multilingual enclave in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. And then you also have the African Americans coming up from the sharecropping South, looking for any better opportunity than they had down there. So baseball became very, very, very important to the teams in the camps. And why wouldn't it be? Because the bosses loved it. The coal company brass loved baseball, and there are quite a few reasons why. First, The bosses were from places like Philadelphia and New York, and they were accustomed to attending major league games anytime that they wanted during the season. Now, they also loved betting on these baseball games, so quite a bit of money exchanged hands on the Sunday baseball game. And here's the kind of dirty part. They loved baseball because they felt like it kept union agitation out of the camps, because it was unlikely that the guys from one dugout were going to run over and talk unions with the guys in the other dugout, because there was this sense of loyalty to the company. So the richer the camp, the richer the coal company, the better the baseball team, because they had the money to hire ringers, and they sent scouts out looking for the best pitchers they could possibly get. They also supplied their players with new uniforms every season. They made sure that the diamonds were big and beautiful, and these guys could come in, make a decent living. They would get nice digs to live in, and they never had to work underground. Now, I'll qualify that later down the road. But the pitchers were too important. The good catchers were too important. They never had to work underground. Now, in those days, because there is such a, baseball, as I discovered in writing Arlie Latham, is such a tight, or was such a tight world. Small, tight, cramped. And there was a grapevine that functioned from one coast to the other. And so let's say that there was a young, aspiring, talented left-handed pitcher, and he was coming from the prairie somewhere, and he was eventually going to make it to the majors. You knew he was going to. He could really hone his skills with some competitive baseball in a coal camp. So you had young men who were destined for the majors coming in to play for a season. But you also had older men who were retired from the major leagues, who could no longer swing the bat the way they used to. And they, too, were coming and finding good places to live and work in the camps. Because, once again, if they could still throw a ball, if they could still bat, they didn't have to work underground. But the most interesting to me of the former major leaguers or big-name baseball players who came to the coal camps were the outlaws. Now, these are the men who have been outlawed from playing organized baseball for any number of reasons, mostly jumping contracts or doing something heinous, according to the baseball world. So the most interesting, the most dramatic, the most colorful set of baseball outlaws in a league that made them happy as they could be was the Copper League. And it was down in the northwestern corner of New Mexico and the southeastern corner of Arizona. So in the Copper League, you had all the men whose names may be familiar to you from the 1919 White Sox scandal, or you had most of them. So when they were outlawed from playing organized baseball, they flooded down to the Copper League. So you've got names like Hal Chase and Chick Gandil and Lefty Williamson and Buck Weaver, and El Paso at one point almost got Shoeless Joe Jackson. And you had these guys going down there and playing some of the best baseball to be found in the country, and playing it for a lot more money than the major leaguers were making. Also, when you talk about the 1919 White Sox, there was one who really played his heart out. He must have known what was going on, but he played his heart out. And so he's remembered in a good way by people who disliked the others. His name was Dickie Carr, and that name might not mean anything to you, except that Dickie Carr, when he retired from the major leagues, went to a place called Huntington, West Virginia, where he became mentor to some guy named Stan Musial. So now, I mentioned how much money the coal companies put out to equip their players and to take care of the field and build them a big grandstand and keep them in perfect uniforms. This was true for the white players and not for the African American players. They were pretty much on their own. They had to get the money together to get new uniforms. They had to get their own equipment, and they could use the diamond in the coal camp only when the white team was not using it. Now, at about this time, we're talking from the turn of the century to maybe the 1940s, barnstorming was at its peak in this country, and there were great barnstorming teams crisscrossing everywhere you went. There were teams like the House of David. We've all seen pictures of them with their luxurious long hair, and there were the Bloomer Girls, and there were the Zulu Cannibal Giants. There were any number of barnstorming teams that made their living doing this. the greatest barnstorming teams in American history, in the history of American baseball, were the Negro Leagues. Now remember, these men were not allowed to play organized baseball because they were black. So the Negro Leagues formed together, and they wanted to support themselves, and they wanted to support themselves playing something that they loved and were really good at, so they barnstormed. Now, if you think about it, in the last few years, Major League Baseball has come around to accept some of the Negro Leagues by season as major leagues, which is a step in the right direction. And so if the Homestead Grays, for instance, if the Pittsburgh Crawfords, for instance, were major leagues, and I believe they were, then some of the teams in southern West Virginia, in the coal fields down there, were their minor leagues. They were the nursery that were nurturing and training really gifted ball players to make it up finally to play in the Negro Leagues. And because the Pittsburgh Crawfords and the Homestead Grays came down to the southern West Virginia coal fields all the time to play the Raleigh Clippers, the Slab Fork Indians, they were really, everybody who lived there was a beneficiary of it, because they got to see Josh Gibson, they got to see Oscar Charleston, they got to see Satchel Paige play ball every summer at least. Now, Southwest Virginia has some pretty legendary Negro League talent, a legendary guy to begin with. He did play briefly for the major leagues. He was born in Lee County. His name was Bob Bowman, and he was the first African-American baseball player to play organized baseball in Dixie. He signed with the Middlesboro Athletics of the Mountain States League in 1951, and he played the entire season. He was the very first, and it was the proudest day of my life when I uncovered that. Now, no talk of Coalfield baseball is complete without mentioning the women who were in the stands, the wives, the mothers, the sisters, the aunts who came to the field. They went to every home game when they could, and they went to every away game when they could, which required some pretty creative travel plans. So they would get on the back of a flatbed, they would hitchhike, they would get to the away games no matter what. And I have to tell you that I talked to a gentleman in New Mexico. He was a Mescalero Apache, and he once was telling me about what it was like for him growing up playing baseball. They played in their Levi's and their cowboy boots. They played in something of a bowl, and the diamond was down in the bottom of it. And the spectators all sat up on the side of the hill. And he said that there was nothing in his life he had ever encountered that was as terrifying as a bad call made by the umpire and every woman on the side swooping down, screaming. Now, I think that does sound pretty scary, but I can say that I don't know that it was any more scary than some of the women in Pennington Gap. Especially three sisters that I knew of. So for every person in the coal camp community, baseball was a significant thing. And I think it was substantially different for them than it was for somebody in Sacramento or Des Moines. And the reason I think that it was probably more, not logos, but pathos, is because the loyalty to the team was born of the loyalty that the miners felt to one another going underground. Because these were a band of brothers going underground. They all had each other's backs. And their families knew the fear and suffering of letting them do that every day. Everybody in the community knew suffering. Everybody in the community knew loss. So with that sort of ethos driving the community, how could they be anything but incredibly, passionately devoted to their baseball team? So now, oddly enough, the coal camps began to sort of die out at about the same time that the wonderful game of baseball, this game of baseball, started morphing into this distinctly unlovable entity that we have today. And sorry, that's how I feel. People ask me what my favorite baseball team is, and it's always the same answer. It's the Brooklyn Dodgers. So, also, besides coal production in the camps going down, the automobile had become increasingly common. So people were able to escape the camp now to find entertainment. So with a car, you could just jump into that and drive to Kingsport or to Bluefield and have a big time on a Saturday night. There was also television, televised baseball, which was a bad, bad thing for the minor leagues in particular. That's why Virgil Q. Wax, the Don Quixote of Southwest Virginia baseball, established the, get this, I'm going to try to do this in one breath, the Anti-Broadcast Commission of Major League Games into Minor League Territories. That was to keep Major League Baseball from being played on your tube, and he never managed to block a single game as far as I know. Now, with Walter O'Malley taking the Brooklyn Dodgers out to Los Angeles, that started expansion. And the borough of Brooklyn never recovered. They mourn to this day. Read Doris Kearns Goodwin. But it started the whole expansion phenomenon, and it sort of inspired the great minor league contraction of the 1950s that saw the number of minor league teams being seriously reduced. So not only are they being reduced across the country, but they're being reduced here, where little towns like Norton and Big Stone Gap, which had Class D professional teams, lose them. And I think that was a blow too. And the recent restructuring of the minor leagues by Major League Baseball was the death knell for a lot of places that had supported their minor league professional teams for decades. And one of those is the Appalachian League. Now that was such a blow. Now, yeah, they're a college league now, and I'm sure that there's some support, but there's something just different about it. Because there's something, to me, when these teams become college teams or they just fold all together, there's something that is sunny and green and youthful that is just lost to us. So I'm going to close out by returning to art. And I wanted to mention that baseball is a sport of magic realism and very potent ghosts. And Hollywood understands this. I mean, think of The Natural and think of Field of Dreams and any other baseball movies out there where there's some sort of supernatural element. You don't find that so much in, say, curling, movies about curling. You just don't. So Hollywood understands it very well. And I understand it too, but in a sort of a different way. So the little spaces that are hanging on the walls in there are mostly interiors. And I built them so that little small ghosts could wander around in them and walk the halls and sort of stare out the windows, maybe work a little piece of peeling wallpaper off a little bit further down. And I can make those environments. I can fashion those. But what I cannot fashion, what I cannot turn into art, are all of the lost diamonds, all the lost baseball fields of this country. They are all the same dimensions. They're all 90. The dimensions are set in stone. But they're surrounded by different horizons. They're surrounded by prairie, or they're surrounded by beautiful mountains, or they're surrounded by an urban landscape. And I can't recreate that. I can't do it. First of all, it's going to be the biggest 3D model you've ever seen. So I have to leave these guys to themselves. I have to leave them to their own devices. These nameless young men with their eager faces in their woolen uniforms. You can see them in the photographs. They are the most poignant of phantoms, and they are now consigned to 2 dimensions and sepia tones. I can't build them a space. But I can almost see them. You can almost see them. They're wandering the weed-choked diamonds of their past, listening to the winds kind of blow through, just looking up at the grandstands if they still exist, and they're just wondering where everybody has gone. Thank you. Anybody have any baseball questions for me or for him? Anybody have a story to share of a granddad who played baseball?
When you said the Appalachian League went to a college league. What exactly do you mean? It's college players who play in the summertime or something like
Mm-hmm.
that?
And they even have metal bats.
Okay.
So it's a college sort of prep.
Okay.
And so, there was a day when you could go and watch your favorite team, and they were professional. They may have been AAA, or they may have been rookie league, like the Appy League was for the longest time. But it was still professional baseball, and there was something to be said for that.
You know of any players that played in the outfield that made it to the major league?
Oh yeah. Okay, there's an absolutely ridiculous piece hanging in there, and it's got shag carpeting, and it's orange, and it's called "He Lived Big he lived large when he made it to the bigs." And I made that and named it in honor of Tracy Stallard, who for a fact did sublet Julie Newmar's apartment. That's a fact. There. Oh, you have another fact, or you have nope. Go you no. Yeah. He subletted Julie Newmar's apartment, and I've got it's like the New York Post or something like that, and I've got a big article on how he and another Met lived in the cat lady's apartment. I mean, what could be better? So Tracy was just one of them. Dave Hillman was another one. Dave Hillman is still living in Kingsport. He played for Boston. He played for St. Louis. He played for New York. They kind of crossed each other. Dave was a little older than Tracy. And the most kind of gut-wrenching, there's a picture that was in that slideshow of a young man holding a bat, a young African-American man holding a bat. His name was Billy Williams. He was from Clinchco, and he played in the Indians farm system forever. He really paid his dues. And a lot of people, including Doc Edwards, who was a major league player from West Virginia, told me he just never got a break. He was good enough to be in the major leagues. Any day of his life, he was good enough to be in the major leagues, but he never got a break. Billy Williams finally got his break in 1969 with the Seattle Pilots, who lasted for one season. And probably the reason for this is that they were encouraged to drink beer in the dugout. But that was his cup of coffee in the bigs. But there are more that date back to earlier than any of those guys. Those are just the three ones that I can name off the top of my head.
Tracy graduated from Coburn High School, and Coburn still has a good, they do well in baseball.
Do they? I hope they're inspired by him.
Kelly does well in baseball, so probably all these roots are this love of baseball has come forth in the.
I hope so. Tracy never really loved baseball, and that was sort of the shocking thing. He when he was playing winter ball in the Caribbean, he loved that. He loved playing in Cuba. He loved playing in Venezuela. He loved playing in Mexico. He loved the people. He loved breaking loose. When he first went down to Cuba, it was during the Revolution. And so there was gunfire going on all the time, and he was told, they were all told, to stay in their rooms and not wander, and you couldn't keep the man down. You couldn't keep him in his room. He loved wandering around in Havana. He didn't care what the risks were. And I think he found the people there just so utterly joyous. And when he did make it to the majors, it became something of a, I mean, we've all seen that picture of Tracy on the mound when he's thrown the 61st to Roger Maris, and he's sort of hanging his head and looking very kind of beleaguered and sad. I don't think he liked that part of baseball, but he was a delightful man to talk to, especially about Havana.
He was our neighbor in Wise.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember that. And when I first went to interview him, this is a great story. When I first went to interview him, I wanted to talk to him about Johnny Padres, because Johnny Padres played for Hazard, the Hazard Bombers, in 1951 in the Mountain States League, and they won the championship. And Johnny Padres, that was 1951, and I believe it was 1954 that he was named Most Valuable Player of the World Series. And so I wanted desperately to talk to Johnny Padres because I wanted to know what he thought about Hazard, Kentucky. And so I was at Tracy's house, and he just gets up and he ambles over to the phone and he's punching in some numbers, and he says to whoever answers the phone at Major League Baseball, he says, "Give me Johnny Padre's number," and they did. And so he tapping in the number again, and I hear him saying, "Well, you were in Hazard, 1951, Coalfield, Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky." Oh, come on, just talk to the woman. But Johnny Padres had no recollection of the entire season. just missed it altogether. So, but Tracy was a gem. I really miss him. He was tremendous. There is a picture. Some of you may recognize the Norton Post Office. It's the team standing in front of the Norton Post Office and with Mr. Esser, and it's sort of a sepia tone picture. And in the back row of that, he's not from here. By the way, this is right before the Ludlow massacre in Colorado. They were playing baseball right before the fuzz came in and killed a lot of people. But so there's this picture of the 1920 Norton team, and there's a gentleman on the back row whose name, he's called the Rabbi of Swat, one of the few Jewish players in the Major League, and he just had a cup of coffee there. He really did. But they thought he was going to be the next Babe Ruth, so they called him the Rabbi of Swat. Anything else? Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming out. It's been my pleasure.
Again, thank everyone for coming. A big round of applause for both Lynn and Teresa for their work. And visit with our quilter today, and also her beautiful work. Thank you all.